Hi gang, so I do a lot of converting, and one of the big things you have to think about when building conversions or using old models is WYSIWYG, a concept that's been part of the hobby for decades, but isn't actually part of the rules. So in this video, I'm going to take a look at what WYSIWYG is for and the effect it has when you're doing things like counts-as. WYSIWYG stands for what you see is what you get, and it's a long-established, I guess, standard for what's an acceptable way to build your army. In short, it means that the models you use should be holding the weapons you've equipped them with in your army list. That tactical squad you've equipped with bolt guns and a plasma gun is holding those exact weapons. The sergeant with a power sword is holding a power sword. The idea is that your opponent should be able to tell what your models are equipped with by simply looking at them. What you see is what you get. Of course, there are exceptions here. Generally, you're not expected to model grenades or pistols or invisible stuff. But the idea is that the most important weapons the model has are visible on the model. If your Space Marine captain comes as standard with a bolt pistol, he doesn't need to be holding it. But if you upgrade him to, say, a plasma pistol, well, your opponent probably wants to know where that plasma pistol is at any given time, so you should show it on the model. And that last example cuts to why WYSIWYG is so important. When your opponent has particularly specialized or powerful weapons dotted around their army, you want to be able to keep track of them so that you keep your vulnerable models away from them. Nobody wants to lose a tank to a melter gun they didn't realize was nearby. And people tend to get annoyed pretty quickly when this sort of agreement is broken. This guy hasn't got a melter gun, he's actually got a flamer. Okay, well now I have to remember that all game. Every time you see the melter gun, oh, no, that's a flamer. That's one thing when all your melter guns are being flamers, but what about when this melter gun's a flamer, but this one is still a melter gun? How are we keeping track? Is this going to result in shenanigans? Oh yeah, the guy next to your tank is the one with the melter gun, honest. Oh, and you didn't realize that unit had the power fist in it, but I told you so 2 hours ago when we set up this game. Look, if you're piling on extra stuff your opponent has to remember, counterintuitive stuff, and they're not asking you to do the same, then you've got an unfair game. One person is having to do more work. So WYSIWYG is considered really important in keeping the game fair. It's a really easy standard to understand, and it just rules out loads of ambiguity. It's still a standard at most organized events. Technically, WYSIWYG only applies to equipment, but we can take the concept behind it a bit further. It's a good general rule for 40k that your army shouldn't be confusing for the opponent. If your models include recognizable things from the game, like say a melter gun, then they should use the rules for that thing. This way of thinking has a big effect when we start talking about counts-as and proxies. Both counts-as and proxies are ways of using models in 40k that aren't the official correct models for the datasheet in question. Proxies are the simplest, so let's get those out of the way first. Proxying is when you use a model or anything else in place of another model. Often someone wants to try out a unit in their army that they don't own the model for, so they use whatever as a placeholder. Generally, this is the sort of thing you do with friends and with their agreement, and usually there's the idea in place that you won't be doing it all the time. It's a one-off until you buy the actual model, or decide not to. Using our expanded version of WYSIWYG, proxies are obviously not WYSIWYG. Everyone playing the game is aware that this model definitely isn't what it represents. They're probably going to stick out like a sore thumb, and you're all going to push through anyway because you're all friends. Hell, with friends you can play with paper tokens if you want. But if you're playing with people you don't know, proxies are usually considered bad gaming etiquette, and for this reason they're often disallowed in organized play. Counts-as, however, is usually allowed in organized play, within reason. And that's because counts-as is basically the opposite, using the wrong models but in a way that doesn't break WYSIWYG and isn't confusing for your opponent. So when people say counts-as, they're usually referring to conversions or third-party models or old models that for whatever reason don't have rules anymore. I use counts-as all the time. I pretty much convert everything I lay my hands on, and I have whole armies of old models with no rules or models built from third-party ranges. I think there are a few secrets to making a good counts-as army that doesn't give your opponent a headache and is probably going to get allowed wherever you want to take it. First, and most importantly, counts-as is when you take a model that has no rules in the game, because it's a conversion or a third-party model or something, and you find some rules in the game to represent it. Don't switch this around. Don't take a model that does have rules in the game and use the rules for something else. That's definitely proxying. People get confused by it. Just like the melter gun example, if you're putting down a rhino, then use the rules for a rhino. If you want to use the rules for something else, Convert it so it looks like something else. Also, this is going to bring up the most common argument about counts-as. Space Marine colour schemes. Is it acceptable to use your Ultramarines to represent Space Wolves or any other chapter in a situation where you're playing with someone you don't know? For me, no, it's not. If your models look like Ultramarines, and Ultramarines have rules in this game, use them. Using something else could be just as confusing for your opponent as having the wrong weapon options. When they look up, they see Ultramarines. Second, stick to conventional WYSIWYG. If your counts-as Imperial Guard are armed with lasguns, put lasguns on them. Or at least something that appreciably looks a bit like a lasgun, or maybe an autogun, just something that looks right. If your specialist has a melter gun, giving them some random weird gun from the third-party sprue won't cut it. It needs to be recognizable as the melter gun. Having good traditional WYSIWYG is going to get your entirely counts-as army accepted more than anything else. Third, if you're looking for a datasheet to represent your models and you have a few options, always go with the least confusing one. If you want to make an army out of these third-party human-sized soldiers, well, they could be Imperial Guard infantry, or they could probably be Tempestus Scions, but using them as Space Marines would probably be a bit of a reach. So don't do it, even if Space Marines are better. If the model's on a bike, use them as something on a bike. If the model's cavalry, count them as something cavalry. If the model looks like it's flying, count it as something that can fly. Don't make it more difficult for your opponent than it has to be, and certainly don't make it more difficult for your opponent because you want to pick the optimal choice. Fourth, don't use similar models to count as two different things. If you want to represent two different units on a tabletop, you're going to have to make sure they look different enough that your opponent can easily tell which is which. And finally, practical stuff. If you want your counts-as to be accepted, it should probably be on the correct base size for the model it's counting as and roughly the same dimensions. I think with an ideal counts-as, your opponent should be able to tell what they represent and what they're armed with by looking. The more you have to explain, the worse it is, and the more likely it won't be allowed in organised play. So let's look at a few examples. These are my Tau Rangers from my old Tau force. I've actually got rid of the rest of the Tau army, but I kept these guys because I really like how the conversions turned out. They're made from a mix of Fire Warriors, Catachans, Imperial Tank Crew, and Kroot weapons. I use them as a Kroot Carnivore squad. These are definitely counts-as, and I think they fit all my criteria. They're armed with the correct weapons, they look appreciably different from anything else in the army, and there's nothing on the equipment or the models that would confuse you. Kroot are more lightly armoured than Fire Warriors, and so are these models. I think most people would be able to guess they count as Kroot just by looking at them, which means, as far as I'm concerned, they're a good counts-as. What would be a bad counts-as for Kroot? Well, Fire Warriors with Kroot rifles would be confusing because they still visually would be just as heavily armoured as regular Fire Warriors. They also have totally different stats, so I think they need to look more different than that. What about Catachans as close combat human auxiliaries? Well, I think first you'd need to replace the lasguns. Having them with Kroot rifle stats would be confusing. But even then, I'd worry that Catachans are already a thing in 40k with established stats and rules. I think you'd need to convert them to look pretty different before they'll be an acceptable counts-as. The nice thing about these guys is that unarmored Tau in jackets don't really exist anywhere else. Let's go for another option. What about these Adeptus Arbiters? I have a whole army of these, and I've taken them to plenty of tournaments and events, but they don't have any official rules anymore, so they've counted as a few different things over the years. They're Imperial troops armed with shotguns and grenade launchers and wearing carapace armor. What are the options? Well, Astra Militarum veterans can have shotguns and grenade launchers, and they have roughly the right stats, but they only have a 5-up save. Doable, but not perfect. Tempestus Scions have grenade launchers and carapace armor, but no shotguns. Now, Arbiters used to have executioner ammo, which gave them guided shotgun shells, so I guess you could argue that that's why their shotguns are using the stat line for hotshot lasguns, but it's a bit of a stretch, and it isn't immediately obvious to your opponent. Again, not perfect. Up until recently, I used them as Death Corps of Krieg engineers, who had shotguns, carapace armor, and the ability to take special weapons. But in the recent update, they lost the ability to take the special weapons, so they might not be the best choice anymore. I could have shotguns, but nothing else. Okay, what about something completely different? Space Marine Scouts have shotguns and have carapace armor, and when you look at the wider army, they fit the bill in a lot of different ways. There are options for bikers or rhino-based vehicles, and of course the other option regular Arbiters have is to take bolt guns. It seems like a good idea, but this means having guys who look in every way like Imperial Guardsmen running around with Toughness 4 and the Angels of Death rules. While it gives me the most most options, it's not the most obvious for my opponent. So nowadays, I'd probably leave the Rhinos and Bolt Guns at home and just take them as a Counts-AS Astra Militarum army, probably of veterans. It should be clear from all this that Counts-AS comes with compromises. If you want to take non-standard models, but you want them to be accepted into organized play, or for people to have fun playing against them, you're going to have to do extra work to make sure it's extremely clear what they represent, and you might not be able to take the most optimal units. Is it still worth the effort? Given some of the amazing conversions and Counts-AS armies out there, I think so. Just remember, the rules for WYSIWYG might only apply to equipment, but the general intent of them kind of applies to everything. Let me know what you think below. Thanks for watching.